Hello everybody, just a brief extra video this week on the Kyle Rittenhouse case. Now there's lots of things that I could say about this, but there's one thing that's particularly interesting to me, which is comparing the Kyle Rittenhouse case to the Trayvon Martin case. Because the Trayvon Martin case was the first big case I was aware of that featured an intersection between the American phenomenon of people being shot and the equally American phenomenon of extreme racial tension. And I think it may actually objectively have been quite a significant moment, not just from my perspective as I became more politically aware, but also from the perspective of America. It seems like just objectively rather than simply from my perspective, this is something which has really ramped up over the last decade. So I thought it would be interesting looking at, a recent example, Kyle Rittenhouse, of a example of people being shot that emerged from increased racial tensions, and like I say, example which I think was maybe sort of the beginning of things really starting to ramp up, which was the Trayvon Martin case. So to give a brief synopsis of the Trayvon Martin case, Martin was walking home and George Zimmerman saw him and decided that he was up to no good. So he called the police and said, hey, would it be kosher if I followed this guy? And the police said, no, don't follow him. But Zimmerman decided to ignore them and stalked Martin down a dark alley. Now, the rest of what I'm going to say is a bit more contentious, but I actually think there's pretty strong evidence it is true. Martin turns around and confronts Zimmerman and says, "Oi, what are you doing? Piss off." At which point Zimmerman reaches for where his gun is. I can't say he reached for his gun because he denies he reached for his gun. He just happened to reach for where his gun is. At which point Martin gets on top of Zimmerman and starts punching him. Or I don't know how many times he really punched him, but he basically physically, has a good old go at Zimmerman. And then Zimmerman is able to actually get his gun, shoot Martin. Now, obviously, Martin was completely in the right here. Zimmerman was already basically acting as an aggressor by stalking Martin. If you stalk someone into a dark alley, if you stalk me down a dark alley, I'm going to turn around to you and go, "Oi, go away." Already that's an act of aggression. It's reasonable of me to interpret you stalking me down a dark alley as an act of aggression. If you then reach for where your gun is, oh boy, am I right to interpret that as an act of aggression. So I'm going to try to attack you, to stop you getting that gun. And indeed, if you do end up actually getting that gun and shooting me, well, it's your fault that you shot me because you were the one who initiated. Basically, you pretty much were involved in every major act of escalation. You stalked me, then you reached for your gun, and then you shot me. Everything I was doing was a reasonable response to that. It was reasonable for me to confront you when you stalked me. It was reasonable for me to attack you when you reached for your gun. And it is ultimately a very sad tragedy that I would then die if you shot me. Now for a synopsis of the Rittenhouse case. So Rittenhouse was in Kenosha, which is where his dad lives, and also where he had a job, and also where he was meeting some friends, and also not very far from where he lived in Illinois. He was there with a gun, basically trying to protect certain areas from being looted and destroyed by protesters, because there had been a series of protests in America recently that had resulted in certain areas being destroyed. So Rittenhouse was there with the intention of trying to deter that. Then he's hanging out around a place. I believe he was putting out a fire that had been started by some protesters, and then somebody shouts, "Let's get him!" Rittenhouse then runs away, at which point somebody fires a warning shot in the air. Rittenhouse turns around, sees one Mr. Rosenbaum, I believe is how you pronounce his name, running at him within kind of arm's reach of him. We don't actually see exactly what happens next, but Rittenhouse shoots Rosenbaum and then goes to run away. Next thing we know, he's running down a road while being chased by a group of protesters. He's continuing to run away. He falls over, at which point he turns around and sees several people almost on top of him. He shoots once, misses, shoots again at somebody who was seemingly about to try to use a skateboard as a weapon. Certainly a skateboard would serve as a force multiplier, which I guess means it would function as a weapon. Anyway, shoots him, he dies. Then another guy comes at him with a handgun. Rittenhouse shoots him too. He gets up, and then he continues to remove himself from the situation. I believe later on he attempts to hand himself into the police, but the police don't actually, acknowledge him or anything like that. He ends up going back to Illinois, where he then turns himself into the police. That's the story. So basically, Rittenhouse was consistently trying to remove himself from any kind of situation where violence was likely to occur, while the people who ultimately ended up being shot by Rittenhouse were consistently chasing Rittenhouse and seeming to be pretty aggressive towards him. Rittenhouse seems to have done a pretty good job at keeping the violence relatively restrained. He only shot people when they were within arm's reach of him, and as soon as there was nobody within arm's reach of him, he no longer felt himself to be under threat and didn't fire his gun anymore. There's not really much of a reason why anybody, I think, should view Rittenhouse as a particularly bad person. I think it's kind of ridiculous that people refer to Rittenhouse as people have called Rittenhouse a domestic terrorist and an active shooter. And it's like, active shooters, like we talk about mass shooters don't consistently run away from the people who they eventually end up shooting. I think that would be that's a very strange dynamic, I think, to refer to as a mass shooting. Somebody being repeatedly chased by people who they then shoot only when the people who are chasing them are close enough to actually do them harm, even without a ranged weapon. And then that's when they ultimately get shot. I don't really think the characterization of Rittenhouse as a mass shooter or a domestic terrorist, or even somebody who had the intention, like this idea that Rittenhouse had this desire to fulfill some kind of self-defense fantasy, that doesn't really seem accurate to me either. It seems as if he basically only used his weapon in moments where I think anybody, regardless of their enthusiasm for shooting a gun or firearms in general, would use a weapon, because it's the point at which anybody should, if they're, just have a basic sense of self-preservation, should feel their life to be at risk. Certainly if I was on the floor and I had people coming at me who had just been chasing me, and one of them had a gun, the other one had a skateboard, which, can it decapitate somebody? No, but certainly I would not want to. I mean, tell you what, I have skateboarded in the past, and I'm not necessarily great at it, and I have just hit myself in the shin with a skateboard. It hurts. I would not want to be hit in the head with any amount of force from a skateboard. So ultimately, I think Rittenhouse is not only not going to be found guilty, of course, but also I don't really think anything he did was particularly unreasonable. So there are some similarities between the Rittenhouse case and the Martin case. For one thing, I think in both cases the teenagers involved were in the right in how they acted to defend themselves. For another thing, they were both being attacked by men who I believe both had criminal records either at the time of attacking, or certainly Zimmerman went on to get a criminal record, because I believe he committed some kind of act of assault, and obviously Rosenbaum had a criminal record. I'm only really focusing on the Rosenbaum thing in this scenario because I think everything that happened after that hinges on whether or not the Rosenbaum thing was justified. Because if the Rosenbaum thing wasn't justified, well, you could say maybe the other people were justified in trying to chase down Rittenhouse, but if the Rosenbaum thing was justified, then the people weren't justified in trying to chase down Rittenhouse. So I'm focusing on the Rosenbaum thing. You also have the pretty obvious similarity that in both cases it was a older man pursuing a teenage boy in the middle of the night, while the teenage boy was actually moving away from them and did not actually appear to be a threat to anybody. However, there are, of course, some significant differences. One being that in the Trayvon Martin case, it was Zimmerman, the older man pursuing, who was armed, while in the Rittenhouse case, it was Rittenhouse, the younger teenager, fleeing, who was armed. And also, kind of unsurprisingly, in both cases, it was the unarmed person who eventually ended up being killed. Trayvon Martin, the younger teenager in one instance, and Rosenbaum, the older male pursuer, in the other instance. Now, I don't think these differences are particularly significant in terms of the morality of both cases, but what I do think is that they are significant in terms of how they affected the outcome. And you do have to wonder, for example, what if Martin had been armed as Rittenhouse had been? It seems like he would have been able to defend himself much more effectively against the man who, by pursuing him, was engaging in an act of aggression. However, it's kind of interesting to imagine what if the Rittenhouse case had more closely resembled the Trayvon Martin case. What if Rittenhouse had been unarmed and been chased by Rosenbaum, who was armed, and what if Rittenhouse had turned around to, first of all, have a verbal confrontation and then later physical confrontation with Rosenbaum and been shot? Certainly, I think that would have been the decidedly less moral outcome. This is, of course, just a wider extension of the very popular phenomenon of imagine if the identities in this scenario are different, which, of course, if you're a sensible person, the identities being different in this scenario really shouldn't change anything. But I suspect for a lot of people it would. What if Rittenhouse had actually been a young black teenager who'd gone to a white nationalist protest, and he was there, maybe joining the Black Panthers or something like that. Or I don't think the Black Panthers actually exist now, but I think there's a new Black Panther party. Either way, some kind of, pro-black militia group, and he was there armed, at which point a group of white supremacists or white nationalists had decided to chase him. They said, hey, let's get him, had chased him, and then when they were within arm's reach of him, he had shot them. Would that be considered unjustified? For me personally, I think it would be considered equally as justified because it's exactly the same scenario, and I don't think that the races of the people, or actually political ideologies of the people involved, affect anything. However, I think unfortunately the reality is that for some people on the left and some people on the right, this would change their opinions of the case, even though it's exactly the same case. I think an interesting thing about the Rittenhouse case, in light of Rosenbaum being clearly the aggressor, is that Rosenbaum was unarmed, but he seemed to be trying to get close to Rittenhouse, and it's reasonable to think that he might have even wanted to disarm Rittenhouse. Now, some people seem to think that Rittenhouse was not justified in shooting Rosenbaum to prevent himself being disarmed, but that seems bizarre to me, because Rittenhouse, sure, really shouldn't have had the gun on his person, but in this scenario, he was not the aggressor. So if you're saying that Rittenhouse should have allowed Rosenbaum to disarm him, you're saying that it should be intuitively obvious that the best situation is for the person removing themselves from the situation to be unarmed, while the person aggressively pursuing somebody should be armed. Basically, if you are somebody who thinks that Rittenhouse was unjustified in shooting Rosenbaum because you don't think that Rosenbaum trying to get Rittenhouse's weapon was a justified reason for Rittenhouse to shoot Rosenbaum, and by the way, what was Rosenbaum trying to do if not to get Rittenhouse's weapon? What was the point in chasing him? Was he planning on beating Rittenhouse up while Rittenhouse was armed the whole time? I can't think of anything that Rosenbaum could possibly have been trying to do by chasing down Rittenhouse that wouldn't be at least as bad as trying to take Rittenhouse's weapon. So if you're saying that Rosenbaum trying to take Rittenhouse's weapon was not a justified reason for Rittenhouse to prevent that happening by shooting Rosenbaum, then it seems like what you're basically saying is that you wanted this to become the Trayvon Martin case. You're saying that your big issue with the Rittenhouse case is that Rittenhouse was armed and Rosenbaum wasn't. And that you're saying, actually, Rittenhouse should have been completely okay with Rosenbaum disarming him. He shouldn't have shot Rosenbaum, as Rosenbaum was within arm's reach of him, capable at that point of grabbing the rifle and possibly wresting it from Rittenhouse, especially considering that he was an older man. You're basically saying that all of that would have been okay, and it was not justified for Rittenhouse to shoot Rosenbaum in order to prevent that. So you are basically saying you wanted the Rittenhouse case to become the Trayvon Martin case. You wanted the older man pursuing the teenage boy to be the one who was armed. Because, I don't know, maybe you think that results in an overall better outcome somehow. I thought comparing the Kyle Rittenhouse case to the Trayvon Martin case would be a useful way to show that I am not political on this. I don't think this is a political issue at all. I do think that there is a genuine debate. I think actually that there are even some debates which I've kind of glossed over here. For example, I do think there is the whole question of, does the fact that Rittenhouse was committing a misdemeanor, I think, by having the gun that he did, does that mean that he didn't have a right to self-defense? That's a topic which I think is bigger and I didn't want to cover in this video considering I wanted it to be short. There is a debate. The point I'm making is there is a debate, but I don't think that debate should be a political debate at all, right? How can it be a political debate when you can basically change the politics of the people involved, you can change the identities of the people involved, and you still end up with the same exact series of actions taking place? Surely you judge it by the actions that occurred. I think there probably are people who think Rittenhouse is in the wrong and would think that Rittenhouse was in the wrong regardless of his race or politics or any other kind of factor that might change the kind of identities involved. And I also think there are people such as myself who think Rittenhouse was broadly in the right and that he would have been in the right regardless, again, of his race or political identification. And if anything, I personally, not being a Trump-supporting conservative, would be more sympathetic to Rittenhouse, if anything, if he tended to agree more with my politics, which of course he doesn't. Ultimately, overall, this is just another chapter in the ever-growing book of things that have become sort of pointlessly politicized, and I think really both sides deserve blame here. I want to stress that I think there are plenty of conservatives who support Rittenhouse, but would not support him at all if he was a Black Lives Matter activist, because they don't really believe in kind of moral principles of him having been justified in self-defense, but rather they just support him because he's on their side. But I think there are also plenty of people on the left who don't like Rittenhouse because they think he's not on, I don't think Rittenhouse is on their side. They recognize that he's not on their side. It does seem interesting to me that so many progressives and left-wingers and liberals and all that kind of stuff who have covered this case from an anti-Rittenhouse stance constantly sort of talk about just this vague idea of who Rittenhouse was, but they never actually substantiate it by looking at the case itself. They'll say, he went there looking for a fight. But they never really substantiate that, and certainly they don't address how Rittenhouse's actions of repeatedly removing himself from confrontation would totally contradict the idea that he went there looking for a fight. They talk about him being a white supremacist, but they don't talk about the fact that he seemed to be perfectly happy to shoot white people and didn't particularly seem to be interested in black people, probably because there weren't any black people actively aggressing against him. The reality is that a lot of the things that are being said about Rittenhouse from the progressive left are just that. They're being said. They're not really being evidenced by anything substantial. Anyway, that's the end of the video. It was just something I felt like saying. Like I said, I could have easily made like a 2-hour video if I was to address all of the complexities of the Rittenhouse case, but I just thought this was an interesting thing. It was something I was thinking about, something I decided I'd talk about.